A shocking incident took place in one of the American cities, which made many think about bias and justice. A racist police officer, based on his biased stereotypes, attacked a black woman. However, when he saw her FBI ID, the situation took an unexpected turn. Today's story touches on important topics of bias and justice. We want to know what you think about this incident. Where are you watching this video from? What thoughts and emotions does this story evoke in you? Leave your comments below, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with current topics. We want to hear your perspective and discuss how we can work together to combat bias and racism in our society. In a small town with gray skies and abandoned buildings, the shadows of prejudice and hatred continue to exist. In this town lived Anna James, a spirited woman with an unyielding spirit. Working for the FBI, she often faced various difficulties, but her determination and professionalism were always at the forefront. One day, when Anna was in civilian clothes, she had to conduct an investigation in one of the disadvantaged areas of the city. The police often patrolled this area, and unfortunately, among them were those who held racist views. One such officer, Ronald Brown, was known for his aggressive manner and prejudice against people from minorities. Anna, walking down the street, attracted Brown's attention. He was in an irritable mood and, noticing her, decided that he had an opportunity to exert his authority. He stopped Anna, although she had not broken any rules. "What are you doing here? This is no place for the likes of you," he said rudely. Anna knew it was best to remain calm in situations like this, so she tried not to get into a confrontation. She introduced herself, but Brown didn't even bother to look at her ID. His bias was blind, and he quickly moved to aggressive action, trying to detain her. However, shortly after he was about to use force, his colleagues who knew Anna and her work intervened. One of them, Thomas, recognized her and approached the scene with alarm. "Ron, what are you doing? That's Anna James from the FBI," he shouted. A momentary flicker of confusion passed through Brown's eyes, and he stepped back. In his mind, all the fragments of hatred and prejudice began to dissolve, and he realized who he was up against. His face paled as he saw that this was a highly professional agent who worked for the good of law and order, regardless of the color of his skin. Brown stood frozen, his expression changing from anger to confusion. The police were as attentive as ever, but this time their gazes were focused on utter remorse and shame. Anna, holding the tension in her voice, lowered the hand where she held her ID and took a deep breath. The street lamps cast long shadows, and yellow spots of light shimmered on the pavement. There was something vaguely tragic and fragile in the evening air. Thomas, who had already gotten out of the car, approached Anna and Brown. He was tall and slender, with warm eyes that reflected genuine concern and worry. "Anna, are you okay?" he asked, but his voice sounded not only concerned, but also angry about what had happened. Anna nodded. "Yes, Thomas, it's okay. We'll have to talk about this later." She turned back to Brown, who was still reeling. Brown looked at her, a tear of shame glistening in his eyes. His hesitation was evident in the way he rubbed the back of his head awkwardly, then sighed, looking at the ground. Anna came closer. "Do you know that your approach could destroy everything we've worked for?" she asked, her voice full of sadness and disappointment. "My colleagues and I face challenges every day, and we fight against bias. When people who are supposed to uphold the law behave like this, it undermines everything we're trying to build." Ronald froze, and his heart seemed to beat faster. Images and memories began to form in his mind. He thought of his ancestors, how they fought for equality and justice. Now in front of him stood a woman he considered lesser because of the color of her skin, and this moment became a lesson for him. As they talked, a few passers-by stopped to watch the scene. The city's silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the faint whisper of the wind. It was a moment of realization, when Brown felt his own inner demons heighten to the point of insanity. It felt as if everything around him had frozen, and his own presence had become irrelevant. Thomas, seeing that the situation was starting to get out of hand, gently suggested, "Ron, maybe we should take this conversation to the ward. We need to sort this out." Brown nodded, and they headed for the patrol car. Anna stayed where she was, her eyes watching them go. Inside, she felt a collective relief, and hoped that this night would bring change. The night shrouded the city in a dark veil, and the heavy clouds seemed as dark as the feelings that filled the streets. Anna remained by the side of the road, where the silence around was interrupted only by the dull hum of cars and rare footsteps. The moon, casting a dim light on the wet asphalt, gave an almost mystical shade to what was happening. Brown and Thomas headed to the patrol car, where another officer, Jane, who was always kind and understanding, was waiting. As they approached, Brown and Jane exchanged a brief, concerned glance. Jane, seeing the look on Brown's face, immediately knew something significant had happened. The patrol car drove away, and Anna felt a fog of fatigue wash over her. She knew her job was demanding, but she never thought she would have to deal with this level of hatred. Thomas approached her, his face illuminated by the soft light of the street lamps, his eyes filled with genuine pity and support. "Anna, I want to apologize for all of this," he said, looking into her eyes. "It was terrible, and I know words can't make it right, but please know that we will do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again." Anna nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. I know you're not to blame for Brown's actions, but you have to understand that this isn't just an accident. This is a systemic problem that requires much more than a simple fix." They headed to the department, and Anna noticed how her steps were becoming heavier. The city, which had once seemed familiar and safe, now resembled a labyrinth, where her own sense of justice was constantly being tested. As soon as they entered the building, Anna felt an icy coldness building up inside her heart. At the station, Brown sat in the corner, his hands shaking, his face pale. He knew his actions had destroyed more than just a moment. It was a blow to his very being, to his self-respect and professionalism. Jane, sitting next to him, tried to calm him down, but she was shaken by what had happened. Thomas had arranged the meeting in a conference room, and although his intentions were honorable, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. He knew that for Brown, this was not just a personal mistake, but an entire world that could be torn apart if he did not deal with the consequences. Anna, tired and exhausted, sat down at the table and looked at everyone present. "We are here to understand the situation, but we need to remember that the consequences go far beyond this moment." Brown's worldview, his bias, is part of a deeper problem that requires real change. Brown looked at Anna with guilt and despair. "I don't know how this happened. I was consumed by my own anger and prejudice, and I know it's wrong. I know I can't just say I'm sorry and expect it to make things right. I'm willing to accept the consequences, whatever they may be." Anna looked at him, her eyes full of compassion and weariness. "An apology is the first step, but what's more important is how you proceed. We must strive for real understanding and correction, not just a superficial solution." Word by word, they began to dissect the situation, and though the night continued its slow progress, it brought with it a sense of hope and the need for change. Everyone present understood that this incident was only the beginning of a long journey to correcting deep and systemic problems. When the meeting ended, Anna walked out of the building, and a chill rose in her soul again, but also a spark of hope. She knew that the fight was just beginning, but she also understood that every step towards justice was important. She saw how her own path intertwined with the path of others, and although the path was thorny, in her heart there was confidence that change was possible. Anna walked out of the department, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The city, immersed in the silence of the night, seemed even more empty and gloomy. Brown's words sounded inexorably in her head, and the feeling that the events of this night were only the beginning of a great struggle that was only just beginning. The evening rain that had started during the meeting had become heavier, and the drops were pounding the asphalt, creating a rhythmic noise. Anna, deep in thought, was moving toward her car when her phone suddenly rang. It was an urgent call from the department. Her heart sank when she heard that one of her undercover agents was missing. The message was laconic, but it conveyed anxiety and urgency. She got into her car and, despite the rain, with the headlights on, drove to one of the most dangerous areas of the city, where her agent had last made contact. The night was rainy and gloomy, and her anxiety grew with each passing minute. The streets, usually bustling, now seemed eerily empty. Every alley and every darkness seemed not only a physical challenge, but also a metaphor for her inner state. When she arrived, her agent, Sarah, was not answering her calls. Anna crept through dark alleys, lit only by the dim light of street lamps that smashed against the wet pavement. She saw that one of the shops Sarah had been conducting surveillance in was open. It was dim and uninviting inside, and Anna entered cautiously, holding her breath. At first, she saw only a few people, who were apparently busy with their own affairs. But at some point, she noticed that a group of men were sitting in the corner of the store. Their appearance and behavior clearly showed that they were engaged in illegal activities. Something in her chest sank when she saw a familiar face in their ranks. This was the man with whom Sarah was supposed to deal. Suddenly, one of the men spotted her, and panic immediately set in. Anna knew the situation could quickly spiral out of control, and her agent instincts kicked in. She tried to contact Sarah and back up, but the line was cut off. Roughly grabbing a few self-defense items, she tried to find Sarah in the chaos. Soon she managed to find out that Sarah was in another room, but unfortunately, her condition was far from good. Sarah was lying on the floor, her face was beaten, and her breathing was ragged. Anna immediately rushed to her, but she knew that her own safety was now also at risk. At that very moment, one of the men came out from around the corner with a gun. He was dressed in black clothes, and there was a terrible gleam in his eyes, as if he was ready for anything. Anna, gritting her teeth, tried to protect Sarah, but the situation was critical. Suddenly, other agents entered the store and a shootout began. In the sounds of gunshots and screams of fear, Anna felt her own heart squeeze with pain and fear for her people. She grabbed Sarah and, despite the strong blows and chaos around her, tried to pull her out of the danger zone. When she finally reached safety, her own injuries became apparent. She felt her strength fading, and everything around her was blurring with the rain and the fury of the night. Sarah was hospitalized. Her condition was critical, and Anna was deeply shaken. She knew that her work carried not only enormous risks, but also enormous emotional burdens. The return to the ward was silent and hard. Every drop of rain, every shadow, and every absorbed feeling was a reminder that failure and loss were part of her journey. She saw Brown, who was also on the ward, and his eyes were full of understanding and deep regret. Soon after her return, everyone involved in the case gathered at the station. Anna, looking at her colleagues and Brown, felt that her struggle with bias and personal tragedy had become even more complex and multifaceted. But despite all the tragedy and dark moments, she knew that her work had profound meaning, and that change required not only professionalism but also human resilience. The city continued to sink into the darkness of night, and each day now seemed especially difficult for Anna. Sarah, who was in hospital, was in critical condition, and every news about her condition became a blow to Anna's feelings. At work, in the department, the atmosphere was filled with tension and anxiety. She could not afford to relax, knowing that her colleagues were in a state of constant stress. One day, a few weeks after the incident, Brown, now fired from his job, met with Anna to talk about what had happened. He was full of remorse and wanted to do everything he could to atone for his mistakes. The meeting took place in a cafe, which was in the shadow of large buildings, lit only by dim lamps. Their conversation was filled with heavy silence and deep understanding. Anna, Brown began, trying to keep his voice calm. I want to explain that I do understand how wrong I was. I understand that my actions have hurt a lot of people, including you. I want you to know that I have begun taking courses in anti-racism and emotional intelligence. I am trying to change my worldview, but I realize that this is not just words. Anna, looking at him, felt her inner tension begin to dissipate, but not completely. Brown, she replied, admitting your mistakes is an important step, but it's important to understand that such changes take time and effort, not just from you, but from the entire system that allows such things to happen. As they continued to talk, Brown acknowledged that his biases weren't just personal, but also part of a larger social structure that supported racism and discrimination. He described how his own upbringing and environment shaped his views, and how he now struggles with the knowledge that he was part of a system that facilitated violence and bias. Anna told him about her experiences, how she had faced bias throughout her career, and how her own loved ones had faced similar difficulties. She described how, even in a department where professionals were supposed to work, she had to deal with racism and discrimination, and how this affected her confidence in her own work. As they talked, Brown and Anna came to understand that the problem of racism and bias was deeper than just individual mistakes. It was a system that required a holistic approach and proactive action to change. They agreed that they would work to change that by supporting training and development for the police and other agencies, helping to create a more just society. Meanwhile, Sarah, in the hospital, was fighting for her life, and her condition became a symbol of a larger crisis affecting the entire city. Every day, her family, colleagues, and Anna gathered around to support her, but not everyone could hide their emotions. Some of Sarah's family members were outraged and angry at how the system had failed to protect them from violence. They became active participants in protests demanding reforms in law enforcement and greater accountability for police actions. Anna, seeing the protests and public opinion begin to change, felt that her own efforts and work were beginning to bear fruit. She began to actively participate in public events and forums dedicated to issues of racism and social justice. A new phase had begun in her life, a phase of active change, a desire to ensure that her work and struggle were not in vain. One day, after speaking at a community event, Anna received a message from one of the activists. The message included photos and videos that showed how other officers, including some who had previously sided with Brown, were becoming actively involved in change. They were taking part in training and developing new protocols aimed at eliminating racial bias and improving interactions with the community. Anna felt that change was indeed possible, and her own quest for justice was re-energized. Her journey had been difficult and challenging, but she knew that every step mattered. Every voice, every action, every change was a step toward creating a more just and equal society. One evening, as she was returning home after a long day of work and social events, Anna looked up at the night sky and a feeling of hope arose in her heart. She knew the struggle was not over and there were still many difficult days ahead, but she also knew that change was possible, and although her own trials were great, her determination and desire for justice were even greater. As time went on, Anna continued her efforts to improve the situation in the department and in society, but despite her diligent efforts, the realities she had to face were often difficult and burdensome. Sarah gradually recovered from the attack, but the process of rehabilitation was long and difficult. Post-traumatic stress and physical injuries left a deep mark on her life. She struggled with constant pain and mental trauma, and her family became her main support. Anna supported her as best she could, organizing help and providing moral support, but she understood that real recovery required more than just words and actions. Meanwhile, the department continued to make internal changes. New training programs for police officers were introduced, focusing on anti-racism and emotional intelligence. However, despite significant efforts, the reality was more complex than expected. Some officers had a hard time accepting the changes, and resistance was noticeable. Outdated attitudes and biases ingrained in the system were not so easily eradicated. Anna noted that despite the official announcements of reform, real change was slow to occur. Internal divisions and resistance from some employees prevented the new standards from being effectively implemented. Even among those who supported the changes, there was anxiety about the possible consequences and the uncertainty of the future. She was actively involved in initiatives to improve public trust in the police. Together with other activists and community members, she organized meetings and roundtables to discuss issues of interaction between the police and citizens. The goal was to create a space for open dialogue to improve mutual understanding and eliminate fears and mistrust. However, this work also encountered difficulties. Some meetings resulted in heated arguments and even aggression from people who were frustrated and unhappy with the slow pace of change. Anna also faced personal threats and negativity from those who saw her work as a threat to their interests. This added additional pressure to her work and personal life. One of the most difficult moments was meeting a group of victims of police violence who came to a public event. These people, many of whom were from families that had suffered violence and discrimination, expressed their frustration and anger. They spoke about how change, despite its appearance, does not address the root of the problem, and that their suffering remains invisible. Anna, after listening to them, realized that her efforts, while important, were not always enough. The system she was trying to change was complex and multi-layered, and required much more than just changing attitudes and policies. A deep rethink of the social structure, legislative measures, and cultural attitudes was needed. One day, Anna attended another meeting where the prospects for police reform at the national level were discussed. She felt that her work and her personal efforts could be part of a larger fight for justice. At the meeting, she presented the results of her experience and research, proposing new initiatives and approaches to eliminate racism and discrimination. Meanwhile, life continued to go on as usual, and Anna tried to find a balance between her professional work and personal life. She continued to support Sarah and her family, and also found time for her loved ones and friends. Despite all the difficulties, she found support in those who were close to her. Her work continued to be challenging and often rewarding. Every step toward change was a step into the unknown, and every success was part of a long journey. Anna understood that her efforts were only part of a larger process that required patience, persistence, and a willingness to face real challenges. Her own struggle was part of the struggle of many, and despite all the difficulties, she continued to move forward, striving to make the world a more just and equal place. Several months passed, and Anna continued her work on police reforms and community engagement. She worked on new initiatives aimed at creating support programs for victims of violence and discrimination. She also organized regular events and trainings for police officers, together with her colleagues, to help them understand and overcome their own biases. Despite her efforts, tensions in the city were growing. Discontent and mistrust on the part of citizens, as well as resistance on the part of the police, left no room for relaxation. At one of the public forums where the results of the reforms and the upcoming steps were discussed, public debate became especially heated. The forum was attended by representatives of various groups, from activists and human rights defenders to local politicians and police officers. The discussion quickly turned into a heated debate as activists began asking questions about the real changes and how the reforms were affecting the lives of ordinary citizens. One activist, Michael, offered sharp criticism. "We see that some changes have been implemented, but there are still too many cases of violence and bias. What real measures are being taken so that we can feel real change? We want to see concrete actions, not just words." Anna, who spoke in response, tried to explain the difficulties of implementing change and the need to continually monitor and adapt programs. But Michael and the other critics were adamant. They demanded reports and concrete data to prove the effectiveness of the new initiatives. The internal conflict within her team was growing. Some police officers continued to complain about the new requirements and training, believing them to be unnecessary and interfering with their work. At the same time, internal investigations showed that the old system of bias had not yet been completely eradicated, and this only added to the pressure on Anna's team. Anna knew that change would take time, but the constant attacks and criticism were starting to leave her feeling drained and hopeless. Her personal life was also suffering. She barely had time for family and friends, and the constant pressure at work was starting to take a toll on her health. Occasional headaches and sleepless nights became her new normal. On one particularly difficult day, Anna was driving home when her car crashed due to slippery roads. She escaped with minor injuries, but the incident served as a reminder of how important it is to take care of her own health. She realized that continuing to work like this without adequate rest could have serious consequences for her physical and emotional state. While she was being treated in the hospital, she reflected on the importance of finding a work-life balance. In a conversation with her doctor, she realized that she needed to rethink her approach to work and find ways to cope with stress more effectively. The doctor advised her to see a psychologist and find time to rest and recuperate. Meanwhile, Sarah, who continued her recovery, showed incredible resilience. Although she still needed help with her rehabilitation, she began to actively participate in public life, giving speeches about the importance of reform and support for victims of violence. Her speeches inspired many, and she became a symbol of courage in the fight for justice. Anna and Sarah worked together on new projects aimed at supporting victims and their families. They organized a series of workshops and educational programs to raise awareness of bias and discrimination. Their efforts began to bear fruit, and some changes in public opinion were noticeable. Anna also began working on creating more transparent mechanisms to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the reforms. Together with other members of her team, she developed a plan for regular monitoring and reporting so that the public could see the real results of the changes. This helped to reduce some of the discontent and increase trust in the reforms. The night before an important public event to report on the progress of reforms, Anna sat at home and looked out the window at the stars. She knew the road to justice was long and difficult, but she also knew that every step in that direction mattered. Her work, while full of challenges, was also full of opportunities for real change and improvement. A sense of determination and hope was rekindled in her heart. Despite all the challenges, she was ready to continue the fight, striving to ensure that her efforts and those of her team would bring positive changes to the lives of people and to a system that needed a profound overhaul and improvement. Several more months passed, and despite the efforts of Anna and her team, tensions in the community only increased. Local news increasingly reported new incidents of racially motivated violence, and protests grew across the city. Anna felt that her job had become even more complex and multi-layered as new incidents of violence and bias, including by some police officers, continued to surface. One night, Anna received an alarming call. She was informed of a serious incident in one of the city's neighborhoods, where a group of black residents had been attacked. The incident was particularly brutal. A group of white extremists had attacked these people, causing them serious injuries. The victims were hospitalized with serious injuries, and their condition was critical. When Anna arrived at the scene, she saw that a crowd had already gathered outside the hospital where the victims were being treated. People were furiously outraged, and the situation was quickly getting out of control. Many began chanting slogans and demanding justice, expressing their dissatisfaction with the current situation. Anna met with the police management and discussed how to handle the situation. Brown, despite his dismissal, came to the scene to support her and provide assistance. He was deeply shaken by the new events and wanted to help in any way possible. Meanwhile, clashes broke out among the crowd. Some protesters began attacking police officers and those perceived to be supporting the racists. The escalation of violence became apparent, and the police, unprepared for such a large scale of protests, found themselves in a difficult situation. Anna knew that the situation required immediate intervention to prevent even more violence. In the midst of all this tragedy, anti-police sentiment in the city grew increasingly violent. A campaign began on social media aimed at denouncing the officers and demanding their dismissal. There were even threats against those who continued to work in the system, which only added to the tension and fear. One day, when tensions reached a critical point, Anna saw groups of people emerging from the city's neighborhoods, expressing their feelings of hatred and anger toward whites who were considered to be adherents of racist ideas. These groups began attacking stores and private homes suspected of supporting racist ideologies. Anna realized that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous and was destabilizing public order. Sarah, still in recovery, also felt the pressure. She saw her own activism efforts engulfed in a wave of violence and hatred, and it was a painful blow. Despite her efforts to help and inspire people, she felt that even the best intentions could be drowned in rage and despair. Anna decided to meet with protest leaders and other community activists to try to find ways to de-escalate the conflict. She knew it was important to maintain an open dialogue and look for solutions that would help reduce tensions and find paths to justice that did not lead to violence. At the meeting, despite the tense atmosphere, she managed to listen to all sides and propose a number of measures aimed at improving relations between the police and the community. She proposed the creation of a special commission that would investigate all cases of violence and racist incidents and provide recommendations for improving police work. However, her proposals were not accepted unconditionally. Many protesters remained skeptical, and their mistrust of the police was deeply rooted. Anna realized that even with the best intentions and proposals, she would have a difficult road ahead to restore trust and justice. The internal conflict and growing tension in the city put a lot of pressure on Anna. She understood that her job required not only professional skills, but also incredible resilience and patience. Her efforts to create a fair and safe society were still relevant, but now they required a new level of determination and strategic approach. The night after the meeting, Anna could not sleep for a long time. Her thoughts were seething with tension and anxiety. She knew that her efforts to compromise and reconcile were only part of a more complex and multi-layered problem. The trust that needed to be restored could not be achieved through a one-time effort. It required ongoing and deep engagement. The next day, Anna received a message about another incident that shook her to the core. In one of the city's most active protest areas, a group of white extremists attacked a black family. The attack was particularly brutal, and the victims suffered not only physically but also emotionally. This event was another blow to an already unstable society. Anna went to the scene, where she was met by the police, who were already in full force. There were many journalists, activists and ordinary citizens who had gathered to express their indignation and support the victims. She saw how public anger had flared up in full force and understood that her task now was not only to direct efforts to restore justice, but also to prevent further violence. Meanwhile, the police department began an internal reorganization. Some police officers who had previously expressed doubts about the reforms began to actively resist the new measures, and this created additional difficulties for Anna and her team. Protests and tensions within the police itself reached a critical point. Discontent and suspicion between the police and society only worsened. Anna and her colleagues organized an additional meeting with the management and representatives of public organizations to discuss ways to solve current problems. At the meeting, it was decided to strengthen the work on creating specialized units to investigate cases of violence and racism, as well as to introduce new mechanisms for monitoring and evaluating the work of police officers. In the weeks following this incident, the situation remained tense. Protests across the city became more frequent and aggressive. The escalating conflict between police and protesters required Anna to be constantly present and involved. She tried to maintain an open dialogue and work to ensure that each side could hear and understand the other. Despite her injuries, Sarah began to actively participate in community life again. Her efforts focused on creating support programs for victims of violence and promoting educational initiatives that could help combat bias. She collaborated with local organizations to create safe spaces for people affected by racism and violence. One day, Sarah invited Anna to an event dedicated to the memory of victims of racist violence. The event brought together many people, including survivors, activists, and government officials. The atmosphere was both touching and difficult. During the event, Anna saw how important every support is and how much society needs real change. While Sarah and Anna worked to improve the situation, the conflict within the city continued to escalate. New clashes occurred, and some radical groups began to act more aggressively. Unfortunately, police violence and bias also continued to arise, which only complicated the situation and deepened the mistrust. Anna knew that to achieve real change, she needed to do more than just implement new programs and conduct training sessions. She needed concrete actions that could change the system and demonstrate that fighting racism and violence was not just a slogan, but real and ongoing work. On one particularly difficult day, Anna met with other reform leaders to discuss their strategy moving forward. During the meeting, she proposed more radical measures, including the creation of an independent commission to investigate police violence and the introduction of mandatory audits of police departments. These proposals were hotly debated, and not all participants in the meeting agreed with them. Some believed that such measures could aggravate the conflict and cause even more discontent among the police. However, Anna felt that without serious and decisive steps, real change would not be achieved. Her determination remained strong even when the situation seemed hopeless. Anna understood that every step towards justice was important, and that only through persistence and joint efforts could barriers be overcome and a society free of racism and violence be created. Winter arrived, and with it not only the weather conditions but also the tension in the city became worse. The cold air was chilling to the bone, and the street protests became even more intense. The sharp drop in temperature added an extra layer of tension and fear to the already dire situation. The situation in the city seemed ready to explode. Anna and her team continued to work on reforms, but each day brought new challenges. One of the most dramatic moments was the unexpected and tragic death of one of the activists, who was known for his passion for justice and the fight against racism. His death, as it turned out, was the result of an attack on him by a group of white extremists. Thousands of people gathered for the activist's funeral. Despite the freezing weather, people came to express their respect and grief. The atmosphere was filled with grief and anger. It was obvious to many that the situation in the city had reached a critical point, and each new incident only added fuel to the fire. Anna, attending the funeral, saw how deep disappointment and sadness was reflected in the faces of those present. In her own heart, there was a heavy sense of loss and hopelessness. She understood that the situation required not only her professional skills, but also her personal strength to endure this turbulent period. During the funeral ceremony, a new incident occurred. A group of protesters, heated and emotionally unstable, began an attack on the local police headquarters. Violence broke out in full force, and a real clash began between the protesters and the police. In this chaotic situation, many police officers, despite instructions to limit force, began to act aggressively. Anna, trying to cope with the crisis, went to the scene to observe the situation and try to help de-escalate the conflict. However, her efforts were hampered by the general chaos and rage on the street. She was caught off guard when one of the protesters, in a fit of anger, accidentally collided with her, and she fell to the ground. Her consciousness was clouded by the impact, and, having lost consciousness, she was taken to the hospital. When Anna came to, she found that her condition was serious, but not critical. Doctors diagnosed a concussion and multiple bruises. As she lay in the ward, her thoughts were completely consumed by reflections on how quickly the situation had escalated and what consequences it might have for her work and for the city. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sarah came to support Anna. She was shocked by what she had seen and felt powerless watching her friends suffer the consequences of the abuse. Sarah, despite her own trauma, wanted to be a support for Anna, but she felt that her efforts did not always have the desired effect. At this time, the city was plunging into even more uncertainty. In response to the violence and unrest, authorities announced a curfew, which only increased tension and protests. The situation in the city became even more unstable, and destructive unrest led to the destruction of property and additional losses. Anna, despite her physical condition, began to actively participate in discussions with her team and colleagues about how to cope with current challenges. she continued to communicate with activists and public organizations, trying to find ways to de-escalate the situation and promote a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Her own recovery was difficult, and each new news about violence in the city only added to the stress. Anna felt that her personal health and job were at risk. Many questions ran through her mind. How far could the conflict go? What consequences would this escalation have for her work and for the city as a whole? By the end of the month, after weeks of intense efforts, tensions in the city were gradually easing. Some measures introduced to prevent violence were showing initial results, albeit slowly. However, despite this progress, the victims of violence and destruction left deep scars on society. Anna understood that the road to justice and rebuilding trust was still long. She knew that her work had only just begun, and that real change would require additional effort and patience. Each new achievement, no matter its size, was a step toward creating a fairer, safer society. Sarah continued her work, supporting victims of violence and helping to create educational programs. Despite all the difficulties, she remained committed to her cause and wanted to contribute to change. Her efforts were also part of a larger fight that was ongoing. Anna and Sarah, despite their personal trials and losses, were willing to continue the fight, knowing that every step, every action, every effort counted. They had hope for change in their hearts and the belief that, despite all the difficulties, it was possible to create a world free of racism and violence. Several more months passed, and the city continued to recover from the unrest and destruction. As the recovery slowed, tensions remained high and many issues remained unresolved. Anna returned to work after rehabilitation, but her physical and emotional state still required attention. Meanwhile, police reforms continued to move forward, but with difficulty. Internal divisions and resistance among police officers continued to hamper the implementation of changes. Although a new anti-crisis training program was adopted, actual progress was slow and uneven. Resentment from those reluctant to embrace the new approaches was sometimes obvious, making the job of Anna and her team even more difficult. One day, in the midst of working on a new project to create more transparent mechanisms for monitoring police actions, Anna received a disturbing message. One of her teammates, James, who was actively involved in investigating cases of violence, had gone missing. James was known for his commitment to the cause and his honest approach to work. His disappearance raised concerns and suspicions. Anna and her team began searching, but every minute counted. They soon learned that James was the last person working on a case involving racist attacks, and his disappearance could be related to his investigation. The search continued for several days, and eventually James's body was found in a deserted area of the city. He had been a victim of violence, and it was a shock to everyone who knew and worked with him. James's death had an impact on the atmosphere within the team and the city. Protests erupted again, but now they had an even more tragic and dark tone. The community demanded justice for James and punishment for those involved in his death. Anna, despite her personal pain and loss, continued to work, knowing that her role in bringing about justice and reform had become even more important. In the wake of the tragedy, Sarah also actively supported initiatives to commemorate James and combat violence. She organized public events to highlight incidents of violence and the loss of those fighting for justice. Her work attracted media and public attention, helping to raise awareness of ongoing issues. New investigations began within the police department. Anna and her team worked to understand exactly how the incident happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. They worked with law enforcement agencies and investigative committees to identify and prosecute those involved in the violence. Meanwhile, public discontent and protests continued unabated. Amidst a difficult political climate and internal resistance within the police force, Anna and her team fought to implement change and combat systemic racism. They continued to work to create a safer and fairer society despite constant threats and challenges. Anna, despite fatigue and emotional stress, remained determined. She understood that every step, every action, every effort mattered. The losses and trials she went through only strengthened her desire to continue the fight for justice. Soon came the news that several key figures linked to racist attacks had been arrested. This was an important step in the fight for justice, but everyone knew it was only the beginning. Transforming the system and restoring trust would take time and persistence. Anna and Sarah continued their work, supporting initiatives to improve policing practices and provide support for victims. Their efforts began to bear fruit. Some changes were visible, and public confidence in the reforms was slowly being restored. However, they knew there was still much work to be done. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities for growth. Despite everything they had experienced, Anna and Sarah continued to believe in the possibility of creating a more just society. They knew that their work would not be complete until there was true justice and equality for all. Another 6 months passed, and tensions in the city gradually decreased. Police and the community began to find common ground, but issues related to racism and bias remained relevant. As part of the efforts to reform the system, Anna continued to actively work to improve relations between the police and the community, and her team achieved some success. However, despite the progress made, not all problems were solved. New incidents and cases periodically emerged, reminding us of previous difficulties. One such case was a conflict between the police and the local community, connected with yet another suspicion of racist behavior. One day, Anna received a report of a new outbreak of violence in one of the city's districts. The situation was complicated by the fact that there was a conflict between the police and a group of local residents who claimed that the police had used excessive force. The incident was reminiscent of those dark times when such events were frequent and inevitable. Anna went to the scene, and her thoughts returned to the beginning of her reform work. She thought about the day she confronted the police officer who had assaulted Sarah, and how that incident had been the catalyst for her own efforts to reform the system. Now, all this time later, she was faced with similar challenges again, reminding her of how far she had come, but also how much more needed to be done. When Anna arrived, she saw anger and discontent boiling over again. People were chanting slogans and demanding justice. The incident had once again divided society and attracted media attention. The situation was threatening to escalate into violence, and Anna knew that her job was not only to deal with the current crisis, but also to prevent a return to old, painful habits. At the scene, Anna met with the team that was handling the situation. She learned that the protests were about police misconduct, and began working to listen to both sides and try to find ways to de-escalate the conflict. During the negotiations, Anna recalled how she had witnessed the initial changes and how they had led to the beginning of reforms. She saw how important it was to continue to fight racism and violence, even when the path seemed difficult and confusing. Her own experiences and lessons learned from past conflicts helped her to deal more effectively with current challenges. One night, when tensions were at their peak, Anna was in her office, working on a report and analysis of the current situation. The room was littered with papers and reports of new incidents and measures to improve the situation. Around midnight, she noticed an old newspaper lying on her desk, a reminder of the very incident that had started her job. The article described the events that had happened to Sarah and the consequences for her and the city. Reading this article was a moment of deep reflection for Anna. She remembered how important it was to fight for justice and how difficult it was to overcome barriers and biases. She saw that her work on reform and victim support was part of a larger fight, and she knew that every step in that direction was important. Anna decided that another round of meetings with community leaders and police officers was needed to discuss the current issues and find ways to address them. She knew that to achieve lasting change, it was important for all parties to work together, not against each other. Sarah, seeing the importance of continuing to work towards peace and justice, reinvigorated her efforts. She began working on new programs to support and engage young people in discussions about racism and violence. These initiatives became an important part of the work to improve police-community relations. Despite the challenges that still existed, Anna and Sarah continued to believe in the possibility of creating a more just society. Their experiences and efforts were important steps towards change, and they remained determined in their fight for justice. And so, each day brought new challenges and opportunities for growth. Anna and Sarah continued their efforts to achieve peace and justice, and each step they took brought the city closer to the long-awaited changes. Despite Anna and Sarah's efforts, issues around racism and bias did not immediately disappear. Memories of past events still affected people, and new incidents of violence continued to surface. Anna felt she needed to do more to change public perceptions and help people believe that real change was possible. Anna soon decided to hold a series of open forums where residents could voice their opinions and concerns directly to police and community leaders. These forums became a platform for dialogue and open discussion, as well as for the generation of new ideas and solutions. The forums attracted public and media attention, with many city residents coming to share their stories and suggestions. The discussions often became emotional, with once hidden feelings coming to the surface. In an atmosphere filled with anger, fear, and hope, participants discussed how the system could be changed to serve the interests of all citizens. One day, a young man named David spoke at the forum. His speech was particularly moving and memorable. He spoke about his own experiences as a victim of racism, how his life had been hampered by bias, and how he felt ignored by the system. His story evoked a wave of sympathy and understanding, and many in the room began to realize how deep and painful the effects of racism can be. Anna, listening to David, felt her own efforts take on even greater significance. She understood that her work was not simply about changing systemic structures, but about giving people a voice and a sense that their experiences matter. Following the forum, Anna and her team began working to implement new proposals that had been put forward by the participants in the discussions. They collaborated with experts and civil society organizations to develop strategies aimed at improving policing practices and providing more effective support for victims of racism. But despite all these efforts, the city was still under strain. Protests had flared up again in some areas, and old issues seemed to be revived. Meanwhile, Sarah faced a new challenge. Her own activists were becoming increasingly divided and conflicted, making her work more difficult. Sarah was forced to hold a series of meetings with group leaders and activists to improve internal communication and strengthen the team. These meetings were difficult and sometimes painful, but ultimately allowed her to better understand how she could create a more cohesive and effective working group. Anna and Sarah decided to join forces to create a new event that would symbolize their commitment to change. They organized a large public forum to discuss the progress of the reforms and listen to the opinions of the city's residents. The forum became an important milestone in the reform process and provided a platform for open discussion of the achievements and the problems that still remained unresolved. On the day of the forum, Anna and Sarah watched as thousands of people gathered to express their opinions and ideas. The atmosphere was both tense and inspiring. People talked about their hopes for the future and what they expected from the reforms. The forum presented new proposals to improve the system, including expanding police training and support programs, improving access to resources for victims of racism, and creating new platforms for discussing public issues. The discussions were frank and sometimes brutal, but ultimately helped set clearer goals and priorities for moving forward. Seeing so many people willing to actively participate in change gave Anna and Sarah a new wave of motivation. Despite all the difficulties and losses, they understood that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. They were ready to continue their work, knowing that every action and every new idea they took contributed to the creation of a more just and equal society. However, the problems and challenges they faced continued to exist. The city was far from healed from the wounds of the past, and there was still much work to do. Anna and Sarah knew that the path to change would require patience, determination, and constant effort. Every day brought new challenges, but Anna and Sarah continued to believe in the possibility of change and the power of working together. They were willing to overcome obstacles and find new paths to justice, despite all the difficulties that came their way. Following the successful public forum, which became an important step in the reform process, Anna and Sarah noticed that public attention and interest in the issues of racism and police reform had increased. This inspired them to create new events and activities aimed at involving a wide audience in the discussion and solution of problems. Anna and Sarah decided to organize a series of open meetings where city residents could directly interact with government officials and police officers, discussing current problems and proposing solutions. These meetings became a platform for constructive dialogue and provided an opportunity for direct participation in the reform process. The first such meeting, held at a community center, attracted a large crowd, including representatives of various community organizations, activists, and ordinary residents. Anna and Sarah addressed the crowd, explaining the purpose of the event and outlining key topics for discussion. At the start of the meeting, Anna asked participants to share their thoughts on what changes they would like to see in policing practices and what steps they thought would be most effective. A raised hand in the audience quickly caught their attention. It was an older man named John, who spoke about how his son had once been a victim of police violence. His voice shook with emotion as he shared his story and demanded stricter oversight of police actions. John asked that new police protocols include mandatory recordings of all interactions with citizens to create a transparent and accountable system. His proposal was met with a strong reaction in the room, with many supporting his idea. Anna and Sarah wrote down the proposal and promised to study it in detail. Then a young woman named Lisa, who was active in human rights activism, came up to the stage. Lisa proposed creating a public committee that would monitor the implementation of reforms and collect feedback from citizens. Her idea was to increase control over the process of change and create a feedback mechanism that would be independent of the authorities. Anna and Sarah expressed gratitude to Lisa for her initiative and promised to consider the possibility of creating such a committee. Their response was met with applause and approval from the audience. One of the most touching moments occurred when a group of teenagers who attended the meeting shared their thoughts on the importance of starting education about human rights and respect for others at an early age. They suggested creating programs in schools that would teach children and teenagers constructive communication skills and understanding of cultural differences. These proposals evoked a strong reaction from those present, and Anna promised that they would work to integrate such programs into the educational system. Teenagers were given the opportunity to perform at school and community events, which helped them feel part of the change process. Over the next few weeks, events like this became a regular part of Anna and Sarah's work. Each new event attracted more people, and they watched as the level of engagement and interest in change grew. These open meetings also allowed Anna and Sarah to learn how they could improve their work and what additional resources and support were needed to successfully implement the reforms. People began to actively participate in the discussions, ask questions and offer ideas, which made the reform process more inclusive and transparent. Anna and Sarah continued to work on implementing the proposals that came from the public. This required considerable effort and time, but they saw real results from their work. Gradually, public opinion began to change, and trust in the reforms began to grow. Every interaction with citizens reminded them of how important their work was and how deeply it touched people's lives. These meetings became not only a platform for exchanging ideas, but also a symbol of hope for a better future. Seeing that society was ready for change and actively participating in the process, Anna and Sarah felt that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. They understood that the path to justice and equality was still a long one, but with the support and active participation of citizens, they were confident that they could achieve their goals. Forums and open meetings became an important part of their work, and they continued to use these platforms to improve police-community relations in an effort to create a fairer and more equal society for all. Over the next few months of reform work, Anna and Sarah watched as the changes gradually began to bear fruit. Forums and open meetings attracted widespread interest and helped establish constructive dialogue between the police and the community. The city began to see the first positive changes: new educational programs in schools, improved police protocols, and the creation of a public committee to monitor the reforms. However, despite this progress, the shadow of the past continued to remind itself. One of these reminders was a large anti-Russian demonstration, which was organized in memory of Sarah and all victims of racist violence. On this day, residents of the city gathered to celebrate achievements and remind themselves that the fight for justice continues. On the day of the event, with thousands of people gathered in a city park, Anna and Sarah participated in a commemoration ceremony. There were posters and banners bearing Sarah's name and that of other victims, and the marchers carried them with pride and respect. Speeches were made about the need to continue the work of reform and the importance of remembering why it was started. One of the most touching parts of the ceremony was the tributes to Sarah from her close friends and family. They remembered her resilience, her fight for justice, and the incredible strength with which she continued to fight despite all the difficulties. These memories made Anna and Sarah realize once again how much their work means and how important it is to keep moving forward. As the event progressed, Anna and Sarah encountered one of the participants, who was holding up a banner with Sarah's picture and her motto, "Justice for All." The man, named Michael, was a friend of Sarah's and active in the reform movement. He spoke about how Sarah's loss had affected him and how her courage had inspired him to participate in protests and events. Michael expressed gratitude to Anna and Sarah for their efforts and said that the changes they had brought about were a source of hope for him. His words reminded Anna of how far they had come and how important it was to continue the work. Anna and Sarah exchanged glances and felt that their efforts were making a difference. That day, amidst the speeches, posters, and symbolic actions, Anna and Sarah saw how Sarah's profound impact on society lives on. They recalled the first incident that led to this work, the horrific incident in which Sarah was attacked by a racist police officer. It became the catalyst for the entire reform process and a reminder of how important it was to act. After the event, as the city settled back into daily life, Anna and Sarah continued their efforts, drawing on the reminder that their work began with a fight against a specific act of injustice. They knew that each day brought new challenges and opportunities for improvement, and they were ready to keep moving forward. Reflecting on the past, Anna felt like she and Sarah had come a long way. Not only had they fought systemic racism, but they had also helped create a platform for open dialogue and solutions. Remembering Sarah and her courage continued to motivate their work and remind them of why they had started this journey. Forums and open meetings continued to be important elements of their work. Each day brought new challenges, but each new step towards change was meaningful and inspiring. Anna and Sarah knew that their fight for justice was not over, but they were confident that with community support and faith in their work, they could achieve their goals and create a more just future. A few months after the park event, as public attention to reform began to wane, Anna and Sarah faced a new, unexpected challenge. Despite visible successes and positive changes, the problem of racism remained deeply rooted and was causing tension in the city. One of the most difficult moments was an incident that took place at a nightclub in the city's South End. On the night of the latest riot, a group of young people, including African Americans, came to the club to celebrate their graduation. The atmosphere was festive, but the evening quickly turned sour when a racist patron began to provoke a conflict. As a result of the verbal altercation, the conflict escalated into a fight, and eventually, several young people were seriously injured. The police, upon arriving at the scene, were met with distrust and anger from both the victims and bystanders. Because of this, the situation quickly escalated, and protests broke out in the streets. Anna and Sarah arrived at the scene early in the morning, when the situation had already gotten out of control. The location was surrounded by large groups of people, some of whom were armed and aggressive. There was a sense of unease and anger in the air, and tensions were running high. Anna and Sarah sought to engage with the protesters and understand what had caused the violence to flare up. In their conversations, protesters shared their experiences of the constant racism they encountered in their daily lives. They said that recent events only highlighted the lack of justice and respect they faced in society. The trial was over, and although public tensions had eased somewhat, Anna and Sarah's work was not over. As a result of their efforts, and thanks to the support of citizens, noticeable changes began to occur in the city. The authorities began to take citizens' demands more seriously, and reforms that had previously seemed complex and difficult to implement began to be implemented. Anna and Sarah continued their efforts to reform the police force, aimed at improving public trust and increasing transparency. One key step was the introduction of new standards for police interactions with citizens. All police patrols were now required to wear cameras to record their actions, which contributed to increased transparency and accountability. In addition, a special independent committee was created to monitor police actions and handle complaints from citizens. This committee consisted of representatives of the public, human rights defenders and legal experts, which ensured that cases were handled objectively and impartially. Sarah also initiated a program to train police officers in cultural competence and bias prevention. These trainings were aimed at increasing their understanding of diversity and developing skills to communicate effectively with different groups of the population. The initial results were encouraging. Police officers began to demonstrate greater sensitivity and respect in their interactions with citizens. One day, Anna and Sarah organized a celebration to celebrate the achievements of the reforms, which became a symbol of a new stage in the life of the city. The square in front of the town hall was decorated with flags and posters telling about the results achieved and the work done. The celebration featured various cultural events, performances by local artists and exhibitions demonstrating the achievements and diversity of the city. Sarah took the stage, where she shared her thoughts on how important all the efforts were and how much they mean to the city. She noted that although the path was difficult, the work was done and the results are already visible. Anna, in turn, spoke about how important it is to continue the work to ensure that the reforms are not reversed and that the changes are sustainable. The event was attended by many city residents who expressed their gratitude to Anna and Sarah for their work and support. One of the most touching moments was the speech of the family of the activist who died at the beginning of the story. They expressed gratitude for the work done to improve the situation and for the fact that their tragedy led to real change. The situation in the city gradually improved. There were fewer conflicts and violence, and new initiatives began to bring positive results. Public trust in the police and authorities began to be restored, and residents began to feel more confident and safe. Anna and Sarah continued to work on new projects aimed at further improving the situation. They focused on creating support programs for victims of violence, improving human rights education programs, and expanding opportunities for citizen involvement in decision-making. One day, during one of her meetings with community leaders, Anna received positive feedback from a former opponent of the reforms. This person, who had previously opposed their actions, now acknowledged that the reforms had indeed brought about changes for the better and that the city had begun to change for the better. Anna and Sarah felt that their efforts had not been in vain. Despite the difficulties and obstacles, they saw that change was possible and that their work did make a difference. They continued to strive for improvement and remained determined in their quest to create a fair and respectful society. A city that had once been mired in deep problems and conflicts was now beginning to open up to new possibilities. The memories of the past had not faded, but they had become part of a story that had led to important lessons and changes. Anna and Sarah knew that their work was not yet done, and that continued effort and commitment would be necessary to achieve full justice and equality. Thus, a new era began in the city, in which the community was ready to work together to create a better future for all its residents. Anna and Sarah, building on the results achieved and sustaining their efforts, continued to move forward, believing in the power of change and the possibility of creating a world free of prejudice and violence. In the months since the activist's tragic death, the changes in the city have become more visible. Reforms that once seemed difficult to implement have begun to bear fruit, and the city has become a model for successfully overcoming issues of racism and injustice. Anna and Sarah continued their work to reform the police and create an inclusive educational environment. Schools introduced new courses on the history and culture of different nations, which helped reduce bias and promote a more respectful and open society. Teachers noted improvements in the classroom, where students began to demonstrate greater willingness to interact and understand. The police have implemented new protocols aimed at de-escalating conflicts and improving interactions with citizens. Officers have begun to undergo regular cultural competency training, which has made their interactions with the public more respectful and transparent. The number of conflicts between police and residents has decreased significantly. Anna and Sarah organized a celebration to celebrate the achievements, which became a symbol of a new stage for the city. The square in front of the town hall was decorated with flags and banners representing achievements and progress. The event included cultural performances, exhibitions and stories about the achievements. Sarah and Anna worked hard to improve the social and economic situation in the city. Support for local businesses and new initiatives created many jobs, which contributed to an increase in the standard of living and a decrease in social tension. City parks and cultural institutions were reconstructed, and new public programs improved the quality of life. In the health sector, mental health prevention and treatment programs were introduced. The creation of a fund to support victims of violence and their families helped them cope with difficulties and provided access to resources for recovery and career advancement. The city has become a venue for numerous conferences and forums discussing successful reform practices. Local and national media have actively covered the city's achievements, which has drawn attention to its successful experience. Seeing the fruits of their efforts, Anna and Sarah organized a large event to honor the people and organizations that had made a difference. The celebration took place at the community center and included exhibits, concerts, and words of gratitude from the community. Looking at all the achievements, Anna and Sarah felt that their work had made a real difference. The city had become a symbol of hope and an example of how to overcome deep problems and build a more just society. They believed in the power of change and continued their work with the confidence that their efforts were making the world a better place. Looking at all the accomplishments, Anna and Sarah felt that their work had truly made a positive difference in the city. A city that was once mired in deep issues of racism and injustice was now an example of how to overcome these challenges and create a more just and equal society. It was not an easy achievement, but the results were clear. Every corner of the city, every public space, now served as a reminder that change was possible. Local residents began to become more involved in the life of the city. Police officers and community activists worked together to maintain the progress made. It was important not only to achieve change, but also to maintain it, ensuring the sustainability of new practices and approaches. At the final event, which was the culmination of all the results achieved, Anna and Sarah took to the stage to thank everyone who had taken part in this process. The square in front of the town hall was filled with residents who had come to celebrate the achievements and express their support. At this point, Anna and Sarah addressed the crowd. "We see our city changing. I see before me living proof that our efforts are bearing fruit. We have created a new reality where respect and fairness are becoming the norm. But this is not the end of the road. How can we continue to move forward, strengthening these achievements and ensuring that they serve for generations to come?" Anna and Sarah invited the audience to think about what they could do to support continued reform and improve their community. They asked everyone to ask themselves, how can you support efforts to create a more inclusive and just society in your own community? What steps could you take to promote further dialogue and understanding between different population groups? How can you help strengthen sustainable change and support those initiatives that have already begun to produce positive results? Viewers began to actively discuss their thoughts and ideas, sharing their plans and suggestions. Some suggested organizing local support groups that would focus on continuing educational programs, while others discussed creating new initiatives to improve interactions with police and community organizations. Anna and Sarah felt that their work had created momentum for further change and inspired people to take action. They saw the importance of maintaining communication and collaboration within the community to ensure that progress was not lost but strengthened. At the end of the event, Anna and Sarah thanked everyone for their participation and support. They reminded that real change begins with each of us and that together we can create a world in which justice and equality are not just ideals, but reality. Thank you to everyone who made this day possible. We hope you take with you not only the memories of today, but also the determination to continue our work. What steps are you willing to take to support change and make our world a better place? And, having concluded their address, Anna and Sarah invited everyone present to continue the discussion and interaction to create plans for further action and implement them in their communities. Anna and Sarah, after finishing their message, watched as people throughout the park began to excitedly discuss their ideas and suggestions. They saw the community coming together and felt that their work had truly made an impact. The square in front of City Hall, lit up and filled with laughter and conversation, became a symbol of a new era for the city. People were chatting, sharing their stories, and planning how they could continue the work Anna and Sarah had begun. A city that had once faced deep issues of racism and injustice was now on its way to creating a more just and inclusive future. Anna and Sarah left the event feeling proud of all that had been achieved and knowing that their work had made a real difference. They knew it was just the beginning of a long journey, but the confidence that change was possible gave them the strength to keep moving forward. When they returned home, each of them found inspiration in what they had been able to accomplish and how people had responded to their efforts. It was a moment of joy and hope, a reminder that justice and equality can be achieved through perseverance, cooperation, and resilience. With this accomplishment in mind, Anna and Sarah knew the city's future was bright and full of opportunity, and while they faced new challenges, they were confident that they and the community could overcome any obstacles. The story of a city that found a way to change continued, and every step they took to improve brought them closer to creating a better world for future generations. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Your opinion is very important to us. What moments did you remember the most? What stories would you like to hear in the future? We are waiting for your comments.